The city of London was alive with the hum of tourists, black cabs rolling down the streets, and the distant chimes of Big Ben. Among the visitors was a woman who had arrived from overseas, eager to explore the famous landmarks, but with an attitude that made her stand out for all the wrong reasons. She was the kind of tourist who believed that money and status gave her the right to act however she pleased. From the moment she stepped off the plane, she made sure everyone around her knew she was important. At the hotel check-in, she sighed loudly, tapping her manicured nails against the counter as the receptionist tried to assist her. "Is this really the best room available?" she asked, her voice dripping with dissatisfaction. "I expected something more grand." The receptionist remained polite, explaining that her room was one of the finest suites available, but she barely listened, waving her hand dismissively. The next morning, she set off to see the sights, wearing expensive designer clothes and a look of boredom. Instead of appreciating the beauty of the city, she seemed more interested in finding things to complain about. The weather was too gloomy, the historic buildings were too old, and the traditional English breakfast she ordered at a cafe was not what she was used to. As she ate, she scrolled through her phone, posting complaints online about how overrated the whole experience was. Despite her attitude, she still wanted to visit Buckingham Palace, one of the most famous attractions in London. She had heard about the royal guards, the soldiers who stood completely still, no matter what happened around them. People always talked about how disciplined they were, never flinching, never reacting. She found it amusing and ridiculous at the same time. "They're just standing there like statues," she muttered to herself. "I bet they don't even have real jobs." When she arrived at the palace gates, she found a crowd of tourists gathered around, taking pictures and admiring the grand structure. The royal guard stood tall and motionless, dressed in their iconic red uniforms and black deerskin hats. There was something impressive about their presence, but she refused to admit it. Instead, she smirked and nudged a fellow tourist. "They don't even blink, huh?" she said with a chuckle. A young couple nearby overheard her and smiled. "It's a tradition," the man explained. "They're highly trained soldiers. It's about discipline and respect." She rolled her eyes. "Please, they're just standing there. Anyone could do that." Ignoring the disapproving looks from other tourists, she pulled out her phone and began recording a video of herself. "All right, guys," she said in a playful voice. "I'm here at Buckingham Palace, and guess what? These guards don't move. At all. It's kinda silly, don't you think?" She zoomed in on one of the guards, taunting him through the camera. The soldier remained perfectly still, eyes fixed straight ahead, his expression unreadable. This only encouraged her. She moved closer to the railing, trying to get a reaction out of him. She waved her hand in front of his face, made funny noises, and even cracked a few jokes about his uniform. The crowd watched in uncomfortable silence, some shaking their heads, others whispering among themselves. But the real trouble began when she walked over to a nearby cafe stand and bought a cup of hot tea. The idea came to her in a flash. What if she did something that forced the guard to react? What if she proved, once and for all, that they weren't as disciplined as people claimed? A mischievous grin spread across her face as she slowly turned back toward the palace. The tourists who had been watching her grew uneasy, sensing that she was about to do something foolish. She took a step closer, the cup in her hand, unaware that she was about to make a mistake she would regret for a long, long time. The tourist held the cup of hot tea in her hand, the steam rising in the cool London air. The idea of testing the royal guard's discipline made her grin. Everyone said they never moved, no matter what happened around them. But she didn't believe it. To her, they were just standing there like decorations, and she was determined to prove that they were not as serious as people claimed. She took a slow sip of her tea, looking around at the other tourists. Some were happily taking pictures, others were whispering among themselves. A few had already noticed her behavior and were watching her cautiously, as if expecting her to do something foolish. She loved attention. The more people looked at her, the more she wanted to do something dramatic. Walking closer to the guard, she smirked and spoke loudly so that people nearby could hear. "So they're really not allowed to move? Not even if something happens?" she asked, pretending to be curious. An older gentleman standing nearby, a local who had probably seen hundreds of tourists come and go, gave her a small nod. "They are highly trained soldiers," he explained patiently. "They take their duty very seriously." She rolled her eyes. "Come on, that's ridiculous. Nobody can just stand still all day. What if I do this?" She clapped her hands loudly near the guard's face. He didn't flinch. The crowd remained silent, some clearly uncomfortable with her actions. A woman standing nearby leaned over and whispered to her friend, "She's going to get in trouble." But the tourist didn't care. She laughed, then turned back to her phone, recording another video. "All right, guys, I'm about to prove that these guards are just pretending. There's no way they won't react to this." She took a deep breath, lifted her cup slightly, and before anyone could stop her, she tossed the tea forward. It wasn't a full throw, more of a careless splash aimed toward the guard's feet. A sharp gasp spread through the crowd. People immediately stepped back, shocked by what they had just witnessed. For a second, it felt as if the entire world had gone silent. The royal guard, standing tall in his red uniform, remained perfectly still, his face unreadable. But something had changed. There was a tension in the air now, a feeling that something serious was about to happen. The tourist's smug smile faltered slightly as she looked around. The energy in the crowd had shifted. Before, people had been annoyed by her antics, but now there was real disapproval in their eyes. Some had even pulled out their phones, recording the scene. She suddenly felt nervous, but she quickly masked it with laughter. "Oh, come on," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "It's just tea. It's not like I did anything bad." But the situation was no longer in her control. Before she could say another word, the guard took a sharp step forward. The sound of his boot hitting the ground echoed loudly. The sudden movement sent a shock through the crowd. People who had been watching quietly now whispered excitedly to one another. The guard's presence was commanding, powerful. He didn't speak, but his movement alone was enough to make the tourist freeze. For the first time since she had arrived in London, she didn't have a comeback. The smirk disappeared from her face. She had expected the guard to ignore her, to stay still no matter what. But now, standing face to face with him, she realized she had made a mistake. A serious mistake. Before she could react, something even more unexpected happened. Another guard, standing further down the row, moved as well. Then another. Within seconds, a group of them had stepped forward, forming a barrier between the palace and the disrespectful tourist. It was a perfectly timed, disciplined movement, one that had clearly been practiced countless times. They weren't just standing there for show. They were soldiers, trained to protect. The tourist swallowed hard, suddenly feeling very small. The playful mood was gone. The people around her weren't laughing. The guards weren't smiling. And now, from the corner of her eye, she saw something that made her heart race. 2 uniformed police officers walking towards her. She had come to Buckingham Palace thinking she could make fun of tradition, that she could turn the royal guards into a joke. But in that moment, as the weight of her actions finally sank in, she realized something else. She was the only joke here, and nobody was laughing. The crowd grew quieter as the royal guard stood firm, unmoving, his eyes still locked straight ahead. But it wasn't just the guard who was now the center of attention. The tourists were all looking at the woman who had thrown the tea, some with surprise, others with disbelief. Her laughter from moments before now seemed hollow, fading quickly as the reality of the situation settled in. The tourist shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting between the guard and the gathering crowd. The smug expression that had been on her face earlier was replaced by a mixture of guilt and confusion. She had expected a reaction, but not this one. She had thought the guard would flinch or shout at her, that he would show some sign of being bothered. But now, as the silence stretched on, She realized that her reckless move might have just landed her in big trouble. The police officers, who had been walking leisurely down the street moments before, were now heading straight toward her. The closer they got, the more she could feel her heart pounding in her chest. She tried to compose herself, but her hands were shaking slightly. This was no longer some silly stunt. This was a serious matter, and she had no idea how it would end. The first officer, a tall man with a no-nonsense expression, approached her. "Ma'am, you've just assaulted a royal guard. Do you know the consequences of your actions?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. The tourist's face flushed. The word assault felt much stronger than anything she had imagined would happen. She had thought she was just having a little fun, but now she was in serious trouble. "I didn't mean any harm," she stammered, trying to explain herself. "It was just a joke, I swear. I didn't think it would be such a big deal." The officer didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned to one of his colleagues, who had been quietly observing. The second officer nodded slightly and then spoke to the first officer. "It's not just a joke when you disrespect a guard on duty. This is a serious matter. We have witnesses, and we also have video footage." He pointed to a few people in the crowd who were still holding up their phones, recording the whole scene. The tourist could feel her stomach drop. She wasn't going to be able to talk her way out of this one. The first officer turned back to her. "We're going to need you to come with us. You'll have to explain yourself to the authorities." His tone was serious, and there was no room for argument. She could see in his eyes that he wasn't going to let her off the hook. As the officers guided her away from the crowd, she felt the eyes of every single person on her. Some people looked at her with pity, others with disdain. She had become a spectacle, a lesson for anyone who might think it was acceptable to mess with the traditions and rules of a country she didn't understand. The royal guards were more than just statues. They were symbols of respect and discipline, and she had just learned that lesson the hard way. The crowd slowly began to disperse, but whispers continued to spread. "Did you see what she did?" one person asked. "She threw tea at a guard." "I can't believe it." Another person shook their head. "Some people just don't understand the history and tradition here. You don't mess with the royal guard." As the tourist was escorted to a nearby police station, she tried to calm her nerves. She had no idea what was going to happen next. She was filled with a mixture of embarrassment and anger. How had she ended up in this situation? She had just wanted to prove a point, to show that the guards were no different from ordinary people. But now, her actions had led her into a mesh she couldn't escape. The officers didn't speak much during the walk to the station. They didn't need to. The consequences of her actions were becoming clearer by the second. She had underestimated the seriousness of the situation, and now it was too late to undo what had been done. As they entered the station, she looked around nervously. She had never expected her trip to London, which she had thought would be full of luxury and excitement, to end like this. She could only imagine the headlines that would soon follow. "Tourist assaults Royal Guard," the news would say. She would be the center of attention, but not in the way she had hoped. As the tourist was led to the police station, her thoughts raced. She had never imagined that a simple act of defiance would lead to this. The weight of what had just happened was beginning to sink in, and with each step she took, the reality of the situation became more and more overwhelming. She had thrown tea at a royal guard. Not just any soldier, one of the most iconic figures of British tradition and respect. When the officers arrived at the station with her, they didn't waste any time. They quickly took her to an interrogation room where she was asked to sit down. The space was small, simple, and bare, with only a table and a few chairs. The police officer who had spoken to her earlier sat across from her, his expression still unreadable. He wasn't angry, but his professionalism made it clear that this wasn't something that could be taken lightly. "Do you understand why you're here?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. The tourist swallowed hard, her throat dry. She wasn't sure how to respond. She had thought the whole thing would be brushed off as a silly joke, but it was becoming painfully clear that this was much more serious. I didn't think it would be a big deal, she admitted quietly, her voice faltering. I just wanted to prove a point. I thought it would be funny. But I didn't realize it would be like this. The officer leaned back slightly in his chair, considering her words. It wasn't funny to the people who were here, and it wasn't funny to the guards, he said. They represent a long-standing tradition of respect and discipline. You don't disrespect them without consequences. Do you understand? She nodded, her face turning red with embarrassment. She had always prided herself on being clever and quick-witted, but now she saw how wrong she had been. What she thought would be a harmless prank had turned into a serious incident that might affect her life for a long time. Your actions were captured on video, the officer continued. You can see in the footage that you were intentionally trying to provoke the guard. This isn't something we can just overlook. The tourist felt the lump form in her throat. She had thought it was all in good fun, but now she realized the impact of her actions. Not only had she disrespected the royal guard, but she had also put herself in a very difficult position. She felt a mix of guilt and regret, but it was too late to take it back. The damage had been done. Meanwhile, back at Buckingham Palace, the news of what had happened was already spreading. Tourists who had witnessed the scene shared their stories, and soon, social media was flooded with posts and videos. The woman's face was everywhere, and she became the subject of ridicule and scorn. Headlines like "Tourist throws tea at Royal Guard" and "Disrespectful tourist arrested after provoking soldier" filled the internet. The backlash was swift and harsh, and the woman could already feel the weight of the public's judgment. Back in the interrogation room, the officer continued to ask her questions. He wasn't being cruel, but he made it clear that this was not a minor issue. "Do you have any idea how serious this could get?" he asked. "You could face charges for assaulting a royal guard, and this kind of behavior could lead to legal consequences. This is a matter of national respect, and your actions have gone against that." She sat there, stunned. Her mind raced as she tried to understand how her trip, which had started as an exciting adventure, had turned into this nightmare. The images of her laughing in front of the guard, mocking him for being motionless, seemed so distant now. What had she been thinking? Why had she felt the need to show off, to try and prove that the royal guard was nothing more than a tourist attraction? "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I really didn't mean to cause any harm. I didn't understand what I was doing. I was wrong." The officer nodded, but his expression didn't soften. "Apologies don't undo what's been done. You'll have to explain yourself to a judge. For now, you're under arrest, and we'll be processing you. We'll also need to inform the British Embassy about this." The tourist felt her heart sink. She had no idea what was going to happen next. All she had wanted was to have fun, to show how different she was from other tourists. But now she had made herself the center of a controversy that had gone far beyond her control. The tourist sat silently in the interrogation room, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and regret. She had never imagined her vacation would take such a turn. She had come to London to experience the culture, to see the sights, and to have fun. But now she was sitting in a police station, facing consequences she wasn't prepared for. Her mind kept going over the events, replaying the moment when she had thrown the tea. Why had she done it? What had she hoped to achieve? The officer who had been questioning her stood up, giving her a moment of silence. He seemed to be waiting for her to process the situation, but all she could think about was how much she wished she could take everything back. She didn't want to be remembered for this. She didn't want to become a symbol of disrespect and ignorance. But as the seconds ticked by, she realized that she might not have a choice. After what felt like an eternity, the officer spoke again. "We're going to contact your embassy," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "They'll need to be informed of what happened. You might be facing legal consequences, and it's important that they know you're under arrest." Her stomach dropped at the mention of legal consequences. She wasn't used to being in trouble, let alone in a foreign country with no idea what could happen next. Her thoughts raced. What if this would end up ruining her trip? What if she was banned from ever returning to the UK? She had made a foolish mistake, but the idea that it could ruin her life felt like too much to bear. I didn't mean for any of this to happen, she said, her voice cracking slightly. It was just a prank. I didn't understand what I was doing. I thought I was being funny, but now I see how wrong I was. The officer listened patiently, but he didn't show any signs of sympathy. He was just doing his job. The problem isn't that you were trying to be funny, he said. The problem is that you didn't respect the traditions of this country. The Royal Guard isn't just a tourist attraction. They represent a long history of discipline and respect. When you threw that tea, you crossed a line. It wasn't just about you having fun. It was about showing disregard for something much bigger. Her face flushed with embarrassment as the officer's words sank in. She had thought it was all a joke, something harmless. But now, as she listened to him, she understood that she had disrespected something that meant a lot to the people around her. It wasn't just about the guard. It was about the history and culture of a whole nation. The officer left the room to make the call to the embassy, leaving her alone with her thoughts. She sat there, staring at the cold, bare walls of the interrogation room. The silence around her felt suffocating. She had always thought of herself as someone who was quick-witted and confident, but now she felt small and foolish. How had it come to this? She thought about the videos that were all over the internet now. She had seen the reactions from the crowd when she threw the tea. Some of them were shocked. Others were disgusted. And then there were the people who had filmed the entire incident, likely sharing it with their friends, family, and social media followers. It was too late to delete anything. The whole world knew what she had done. Her mind wandered to her family back home. What would they think when they found out? How would they react? She had always been the one to share exciting stories and experiences from her travels, but now all she could imagine was their disappointment. When the officer returned, he was no longer alone. A second officer had come with him, and they both stood in the doorway. "We've contacted your embassy," the first officer said. "They're sending someone to speak with you. For now, we'll need to hold you here until they arrive." She nodded numbly, still trying to absorb everything that was happening. The idea of waiting in the police station felt like an eternity, but she knew there was nothing she could do to speed it up. She had made her bed, and now she had to lie in it. As she sat there, waiting for the embassy representative to arrive, she thought about how quickly things could change. One impulsive action had turned her entire vacation upside down. She had thought she was being clever, but now she realized how much she had underestimated the consequences of her actions. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours as the tourist sat alone in the interrogation room. The silence around her was almost unbearable, and the thoughts running through her mind were overwhelming. She couldn't stop thinking about how one foolish decision had completely changed the course of her trip. A simple act of trying to prove something had turned into a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hall, and the door to the room opened. The officer who had been questioning her entered, followed by another person. The new arrival was a man in a sharp suit, someone who clearly carried the weight of authority. She could tell instantly that he wasn't just any regular person. He was here for something more serious. "This is Mr. Reynolds," the officer said, his voice calm. "He's from your embassy." The tourist stood up automatically, feeling a sudden wave of nerves wash over her. She had no idea what to expect. The embassy representative, Mr. Reynolds, extended his hand, his expression professional but not unfriendly. "I understand you've been having a difficult time," Mr. Reynolds said, offering a slight smile. "I'm here to help you with the situation." She shook his hand, trying to steady her trembling fingers. "I never meant for any of this to happen," she said quietly, her voice filled with regret. "It was supposed to be just a harmless joke, but now it's gotten so out of hand." Mr. Reynolds nodded, taking a seat across from her. "I've already spoken to the police about the situation, and I'm here to make sure you understand your rights. From what I gather, you've been charged with causing a disturbance and disrespecting a royal guard. both of which are taken very seriously in this country. Her heart sank even further as she listened to his words. She had heard the term disrespecting a royal guard, but it never seemed so severe until now. She had no idea what was going to happen to her. The idea of facing legal consequences in a foreign country was terrifying. "I understand that," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I honestly didn't think it would be like this. I just thought it would be funny, you know. But now I see how wrong I was." Mr. Reynolds regarded her with a calm gaze, his eyes assessing her, but his tone remained understanding. "It's important to recognize that the Royal Guards are not just soldiers. They represent a piece of British history and tradition. People who come here are expected to respect that, even if they don't fully understand it. I'm sure you didn't realize the gravity of the situation when you threw the tea, but your actions have consequences." The words hit her hard. She had been so caught up in trying to make a point, trying to prove that the Royal Guard was no different from anyone else, that she had completely ignored the history behind them. She had underestimated the significance of her actions, and now, as she sat there in front of Mr. Reynolds, it was clear that her joke had cost her more than she ever imagined. "I understand now," she said, the weight of her mistake starting to settle in. "I never meant to offend anyone. I wasn't thinking about the traditions or what the guards represent. I just thought it was funny. But now I see it wasn't. I was wrong, and I'm really sorry for what I did." Mr. Reynolds nodded again, his face still serious but slightly softer now. "The apology is a step in the right direction," he said. "But you need to understand that this isn't something that can be taken lightly. You'll have to face the consequences, but I will do what I can to help you navigate this. It's also important that you stay calm and cooperative from here on out." The tourist nodded, feeling a little more relieved to have someone on her side, but the fear of what would come next still loomed over her. "What happens now?" she asked. "Am I going to be arrested? Will I be banned from the UK?" "We'll need to wait and see," Mr. Reynolds replied. "There will be a hearing, and you'll be able to explain your side of the story. Depending on the outcome, you could face a fine or other penalties. As for being banned, it's not something that typically happens for first-time offenses like this, but that will depend on the final decision." The tourist let out a sigh of relief, but it was only temporary. There was still so much uncertainty. She had thought that her trip would be full of excitement and adventure, but instead, she had become the center of a public scandal. She could already imagine the headlines, the videos, the comments, all of it. It felt like the world was watching her every move. Mr. Reynolds stood up, signaling that their conversation was coming to an end for now. "I'll stay in touch with the authorities and keep you updated on any developments. For now, you'll have to wait for your hearing. I recommend you use this time to reflect on what happened and take this as an important lesson." The hours seemed to drag by as the tourist sat in the small, quiet room. She had hoped that things would get easier with time, but instead, the weight of the situation only seemed to grow heavier. Every time she thought about what had happened, she felt more and more embarrassed. She kept replaying the moment in her head. How she had laughed as she threw the tea, how she had believed it was all in good fun. Now it felt like a lifetime ago. Her actions had sparked a chain of events she couldn't undo, and all she could do was wait to see how it would end. Eventually, an officer came to the door and knocked. "Your hearing is scheduled," he said. "It's time to go." Her heart raced as she stood up. She hadn't been sure what to expect from the hearing, but now that it was happening, she felt the nervousness flood over her again. She followed the officer down the hallway and into a small, official-looking room. It was cold and bare, with just a table, a few chairs, and a set of monitors. The atmosphere was nothing like the bustling streets of London or the lively sights she had enjoyed earlier in the trip. This was serious, and there was no escaping the reality of the moment. At the front of the room sat a man and a woman, both wearing formal attire. They looked up as she entered, and she immediately felt the weight of their gaze. The man spoke first. "We are here today to discuss the incident involving you and the Royal Guard. Do you understand the charges against you?" She nodded, her throat dry. "Yes," she said, her voice quiet. "I understand. I threw tea at the guard. I didn't mean to cause harm. It was a mistake." The woman, who had been watching her carefully, leaned forward slightly. "This is a serious matter," she said. "The Royal Guard is not just a symbol of military strength. They are a part of the national heritage of this country. Disrespecting them is not something that can be taken lightly." "I know," the tourist replied, her voice shaky. "I didn't realize the importance of it. I thought it was just a guard standing there, not realizing the tradition behind it. But now I understand, and I regret what I did." The man nodded slightly, then turned to the officer who had escorted her into the room. The officer spoke briefly to the pair, explaining the details of the incident. She tried to focus on the conversation, but it was hard not to feel overwhelmed. Everything she had thought she knew about the situation seemed so far away now. She had assumed it would all blow over, but now she saw the gravity of her actions. "I can't take back what I did," she said, her voice breaking. "But I want to make it right. I just want to apologize and move forward." The woman gave her a sympathetic look, but didn't soften her tone. "Apologies are important, but they don't undo the consequences. You've disrupted not only a ceremony, but also the respect that is given to the Royal Guard. This is a matter of national pride." The room felt colder with every word spoken, and the tourist could feel the walls closing in. She had never felt so small, so out of place. She had never intended to cause harm or make a scene. She had just wanted to be funny, to show how clever she could be. But now, as she faced the full weight of the situation, she realized just how naive she had been. "What will happen to me?" she asked, almost afraid to hear the answer. "Will I be fined? Will I be allowed to leave?" The man looked at her seriously. "The final decision will be made after we review all the evidence and the circumstances. You may face a fine or other penalties, but the important thing is that you understand the seriousness of your actions. This isn't about punishing you. It's about making sure you learn from this." The tourist nodded, feeling a wave of relief wash over her. She didn't want to go to jail or be banned from the country. All she wanted was to learn from her mistake and move on with her life. She just had to wait and hope that the decision wouldn't be too harsh. The officer who had escorted her in spoke up again. "We will notify you of the final decision shortly. For now, you can return to the station, but please remember, you must stay available for any follow-up actions." As she left the hearing room, she felt a sense of both fear and hope. The worst of it was over, but the uncertainty still lingered. She had no idea what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure. Her actions had changed everything. What had started as a fun, carefree trip had turned into a lesson in respect and consequences. She would never forget it, no matter what happened next. As she walked back through the station, her thoughts were a mixture of relief and regret. She still didn't know how the story would end, but one thing was certain. She would never look at a royal guard the same way again. And she hoped that no one else would make the same mistake she had. The day of the final decision arrived sooner than she expected. The tourist had spent the last few days in a constant state of nervous anticipation, checking her phone every few minutes, hoping for some sort of update. Her mind kept going back to that moment when she had thrown the tea at the Royal Guard. It felt like a mistake that had spiraled out of control, and now she was waiting to see how it would all end. She had tried to distract herself during the wait, visiting a few nearby landmarks and exploring the city, but the weight of the situation always seemed to follow her. Even when she was surrounded by the beauty of London, it was hard to escape the reality of the consequences she might face. She knew it wasn't just about the fine or the penalties. It was about how her actions had impacted her experience and how people might see her from now on. As she sat in her hotel room, her phone finally buzzed with a message from Mr. Reynolds, the embassy representative who had been helping her through the process. Her heart skipped a beat as she opened the message. "It's time to meet. The decision has been made." She felt a wave of dread wash over her, but also a sense of relief. The waiting was the hardest part, and now it would finally be over. She quickly gathered her things and made her way to the embassy, her thoughts racing as she walked. What would the decision be? Would she be fined? Would she face more serious consequences? She couldn't help but feel like her entire future was hanging in the balance. When she arrived at the embassy, Mr. Reynolds was already waiting for her. His face was as serious as always, but this time there was a glimmer of reassurance in his eyes. "Let's go into the meeting room," he said, his voice calm. The tourist followed him, her stomach churning with anxiety. As they entered the room, the two officials who had been part of the hearing were already there, along with a few other embassy staff members. The atmosphere was formal, but she could sense that the moment of judgment was near. The man who had spoken at the hearing addressed her directly. "We've reviewed all the evidence and the circumstances surrounding the incident. After careful consideration, we've decided on a course of action." She held her breath, waiting for the verdict. Every second felt like an eternity. "The decision is that you will receive a fine," the woman said. "It will be a substantial amount, but it is not as severe as other penalties might have been. You are also required to write an apology to the Royal Guard and the people of London for your actions. This will be kept on record, but there will be no criminal charges filed against you." The weight of the words hit her all at once. It wasn't as bad as she had feared, but it still stung. The fine was a significant amount of money, more than she had expected, but at least it wasn't a jail sentence. And the apology, while humbling, was something she could do. She had made a mistake, and now it was time to show that she understood the seriousness of it. "I understand," she said quietly, her voice shaky. "I never intended for it to go this far. I truly regret my actions." The man nodded. "We appreciate your understanding. This fine will serve as both a punishment and a reminder of the importance of respecting the traditions of this country. You've learned a valuable lesson, and we hope this experience will shape your future actions." Mr. Reynolds added, "You will be able to leave the UK once the fine is paid and the apology is submitted. But remember, this is an opportunity for growth, not just for you, but for others who may learn from your mistake." The tourist nodded again, feeling the mixture of relief and guilt. The situation had been resolved, but she knew that the lesson would stay with her for the rest of her life. She had been lucky in many ways. The fine was difficult, but it wasn't something she couldn't manage. The apology would take effort, but it was the least she could do to make amends. As she left the embassy, her mind was still processing everything. She had expected the worst, but the outcome was a reminder of the importance of second chances. It was a harsh lesson, but it was one that would make her a better person in the end. She would never forget the mistakes she made, but now she had the chance to move forward with a deeper understanding of respect and responsibility. She took a deep breath as she stepped out into the London streets once again. The city felt different now, not just in the sense of having learned a painful lesson, but also in the sense that it had been a humbling experience. She could still enjoy the beauty of London, but it was clear to her that there was always more to learn, and always more to respect.